Hello and welcome back to Highwater Pass. So, couple of updates. The first thing is my mic has changed. I'm using my brother's Yeti, so hopefully the audio quality in this one is going to be a little bit better. The second thing is not in the next coming videos, but shortly thereafter. I finally got a different monitor, which has solved several of our problems with the aspect ratio being too large for YouTube, so hopefully the videos will look much better in the near future as well. So, with that out of the way, as you've noticed, we've started right in on the video with this one. This is going to be a full time lapse. We're not going to be hopping into the game all that much in order to look around. I did try and get as much B-reel of the animals as I could, but operative word there, animals. The good news is that we have finally actually added actual animals into Highwater Pass, not just as testing, but like, they're here. So these next few videos, I believe there's going to be 4 of them, our only focus is going to be going through and adding all of the animals to the designated habitats and making whatever changes we need in order to make those look good. You know, just fleshing out the zoo. And then after this is done, the zoo will be available on Steam to download if you want to go walk around through it. So, with that out of the way, I want to go ahead and let's go ahead and just talk about what's happening on screen here. Okay, so about this habitat, we're starting at the beginning, and we're going to go ahead and add the buffalo and the pronghorn antelope to their enclosure. This took forever, not because the idea was particularly unique or complex, but because the bison in this game are just super buggy. Like, the grass is too tall for them to walk over. Let me reiterate that. The grass is impassable to bison. They need to fix this. As far as I know, the new North American buffalo grass might not have the same problem. But they have to understand that, you know, grass is grass. We're going to add it to our buffalo enclosures, and it doesn't much matter, you know, whether or not it's from the right continent. This is ridiculous, frankly, and I hope that they get this bug fixed pretty soon here, because my workaround ended up being to submerge the grass. It worked all right. It looks a little bit funny, but overall, I think we did okay. Thankfully, the pronghorn antelope had no such issues. This is just a bison problem. Additionally weird, the bison couldn't traverse the rocks that I put down either. Now, bison are big, heavy animals, this is true, and they don't normally, you know, mountain climb in the same way that, like, goats or ibex do, but they are found in the rocky regions of North America. You know, they're found in the Rocky Mountains. They're found on that western side. It's going to be rough terrain, it's going to be very rocky, and yes, they do live in the plains in those regions, but they do need to traverse from one field to another. I did look into this a little bit, and according to Capital Reef Country, one of the websites that I found, they do actually migrate up to higher elevations for their falls and winters. So it's reasonable to think that the buffalo should have no problems covering these particular rocks. They should be able to manage those. Unfortunately, the bison in-game just couldn't. So what we ended up having to do was remove a lot of the cool stuff. We had to move around the terrain, get rid of some of the trees, just to make sure that everything actually looked decent while also meeting the requirements of the bison. For this particular thing, I tried not to, as much as I could, but I ended up having to remove welfare restrictions just so that way I could get these two happy in their enclosure and have it look good for YouTube. So there's sort of a mixed balance there on whether or not this is practical or not. So let's actually talk a little bit about bison and pronghorn antelope, because, you know, being a North American, we have these animals. They're not in my backyard per se, but I've definitely seen them in real life and up close, you know, as close as it's safe to get to a bison. You'll hear me swap between bison and buffalo quite a lot. The names are interchangeable. My mom's students have been correcting her, like, no, it's a bison, it's not a buffalo, and she grew up with buffalo. This was a whole conversation we had. According to the WWF, from what I checked, bison and buffalo are interchangeable. Buffalo is sort of a generic term that refers to any massive ungulate that is larger than a cow. hence, African water buffalo, which I think is why they're trying to move away from water buffalo and specify bison, because that's a much more specific term. We don't use bison for anything else besides these particular animals. But, being part of North America, they're sort of part of the North American ecosystem, both in the natural sense and in our economic and living sense, which means that for us, we actually eat both bison and pronghorn here in the United States. They're not common game animals, but you can actually find bison meat in grocery stores, and pronghorn antelope are a favorite of hunters. In fact, we have some just south of where I am, actually, the pronghorns, not the bison. So, sadly, I've never gotten to actually taste pronghorn antelope. I've heard that they taste very good. I have had bison, and they're fantastic. They're very high in iron content, so if you happen to be of the female persuasion, as am I, bison meat, it'll do some good things for your health. Now that might sound monstrous, considering the history of bison in this nation, About, I want to say, 80, maybe 100 years ago, about 100 years ago, the population had been hunted down so badly that there were only 500 left in the entire wild. There were none, and this is down from thousands, tens of thousands. And this was obviously symptomatic of colonization. When the Europeans got to America, this was not an empty land, right? People were living here, and they decided to take that land for themselves. And part of that was, killing off the Native Americans' food source, which was the buffalo. Thankfully, this story does have quite the happy ending. Later on, as this war against the people who already lived here sort of petered to a close, that's not a happy story. But what is good is that the United States has recognized some of their rights, and more importantly, conservation efforts conservationists have started to actually work with the Native Americans in order to try and recover, the ecology and North America to what it was before the colonists happened. And part of that was the rebuilding of the buffalo species. It's been fantastic. We now have, huge herds of buffalo. There's a news story just about every day of somebody getting mauled in Yellowstone. Don't touch them. Don't pet the pretty cows. They're not cows, and they will kill you. But the Native Americans, especially the Sioux and the Lakota tribes, have managed to rebuild the population of buffalo to the point now where, they're no longer critically endangered. They're actually thriving, and they have space for them. It's a huge conservation story. And to the point now where, yes, buffalo meat can be bought in grocery stores. Not very often. You have to look for it, but, it's available to you. And again, that's not because, we are butchering these animals into extinction. It's actually it's sort of a sign of how healthy the population is doing. It's really wonderful. As for the pronghorns, their name would indicate that they're some kind of antelope. Of course, they're not. They're sort of their own thing. The American species branched off from, the old world several 100,000 years ago. So they're very much their own thing, but they're in sort of a similar family, to antelope, which is why we call them that. So anyway, it looks like we're finally getting done with this particular habitat. It was long and painful. So let's go ahead and we'll move on to the binturong. So when I first built this particular habitat, my intention was actually to put cougars here. I think I've mentioned that before. But after calculating the actual size of the area, I realized that cougars were not going to fit. And this is before considering that cougars are just a really weird entrance animal. I mean, it's like you come to the zoo to go see the big animals, but I mean, if you walk in and you immediately see the lions, the buffalo, and the elephant, I mean, what are you gonna do? You're just gonna turn around. You're not gonna stick around for like the flamingos, So I ended up going with something that would actually fit the space, even if it doesn't have anything to do with North America. And that was, of course, the binturong. So they're here. Their habitat's a little bit, I'm not happy with it. It's a very cool space. Unfortunately, it doesn't give a lot of good visibility to these animals. If you decide to download the map and come visit, I recommend that you go onto this back porch over here and look down. That's a really good spot to see into the binturong enclosure, and I tried to make sure that those ceilings were as see-through as possible considering the area. So, as for some actual binturong facts, they're found from Nepal to Indonesia, so massive spread across most of Eastern Asia, that southern Eastern Asia portion. Lots of biomes they're comfortable in. The most well-known thing about them, of course, is that their urine smells like popcorn. This is thanks to a special chemical compound found in their urine. And then, of course, you know, when you look at them, they of course have the nickname bear cat, but of course they're not actually a bear or a cat. Taxonomically speaking, they're actually most closely related to civets and genets. Although, it is important to note that they are by far the tankiest of their taxa. Despite having a prehensile tail and being an arboreal species, their size makes them very cumbersome in the trees, so they actually have to descend to the ground to travel quite a bit. Unfortunately, their habitat is, you know, threatened due to, you know, human action. They're suffering quite a bit of habitat loss, and this is having, you know, a hard impact on their species. You know, I believe they are now qualified as endangered, or if not endangered, right in that area. However, as sort of an interesting aspect to all of this, you know, when humans and animals meet, usually it results in massive death for the animals, but sometimes you end up with this weird intermixture. And an example of this, and forgive me for my pronunciation, but I'm gonna say the orang asli, who are one of the indigenous peoples of Malaysia, supposedly keep binturongs as pets. Now, I haven't been able to look up anything about this. I'm kind of running out of time here. So I don't want to go into this too much in depth. But I do think that's very interesting, and I would love to look into that a little bit further. You know, how do they keep them as pets? What does this look like? Is it possible because of their lifestyle, you know? So, that being said, though, that does not mean that you should be keeping a binturong as a pet. These are not, you know, domesticated animals. Even the ones that they're keeping, as far as I can tell, are not domesticated animals. These are wild animals. And so they're going to come with the problems of having a wild animal in your house. So don't bring one home. So from here, we go ahead and move south towards the red-crowned crane. Originally, I knew just about nothing about these birds. I mean, I'd seen them, you know, mostly as motifs and things, but it wasn't until I actually saw Leaf's Japanese pop highlight for his Boggy Bottom Zoo that I learned anything about them. He explains that aspect of their history far better than I can. So, if you want to learn a little bit more about the red-crowned crane, I'd definitely go watch his video. But let's address why the binturong and the red-crowned crane are even in the zoo, considering that this is supposedly a North American zoo. Specifically, I wanted to highlight as many North American animals as I could, again, especially because I live here. But there are, of course, exceptions in the Asian animals that we're adding along with our North American animals. This is sort of to analogize the biological similarities between the United States and Asia. We have a shocking amount of animals in common, and, you know, we often tend to exoticize the ones that we don't. You know, Asia has tigers, we don't, we have the cougar. Asia has muskox, we have buffalo, you know. So there are these clear differences and boundaries between, you know, our two continents, as would make sense, you know, there's a massive ocean in between us. But that being said, we have a lot of things that are very similar to each other. And in this particular case, the red-crowned crane is very analogous to our blue heron, which also happens to be one of my favorite large native birds. Both of them are wading birds, both of them hunt for fish in the shallows of riverbeds, both are beautiful and iconic of their respective homes, and they're also both migratory. But, you know, that's not to say that they're the exact same animal. Obviously, they're quite different from each other. One is a heron and the other is a crane. Taxonomically speaking, they are not related to each other. And then, of course, they have their looks and their natural habitats. Red-crowned crane do very well in sort of these, colder environments than we would expect. They do quite well in Japan. Whereas the blue heron, it can be found across the entirety of North America, just depending on where they are in their migratory habits. But they prefer the swamps of Florida. Or at least, that's where I've seen them the most. Their diet is also a bit different. Blue herons are very carnivorous. They have a diet that includes a wide range of animals, but they don't really eat vegetation. If they do have any, it'll be fairly incidental, They eat a lot of salamanders, turtles, snakes, but then also, plenty of insects, and then, obviously fish if they can get their hands on it. They're fairly opportunistic carnivores, so that's something to kind of remember here, is that if it lives in a river, there's a good chance that a heron is going to go after it. Meanwhile, with the red-crowned crane, they're also very carnivorous for their particular bunch of cranes. Their family has a spread between carnivorous and herbivorous. Red-crowned crane is very carnivorous. But that being said, their diet does include a lot of vegetation. Rice makes up a fairly large portion of their diet, especially in the wintering months. But then, they also eat a number of grasses. And they tend to prefer, high vegetation with crude protein and low amounts of crude fiber. But yeah, so there's quite a few similarities and differences between red-crowned cranes and herons. And since we don't have herons in the game, I figured that I would do sort of the next closest thing that, kind of analogizes to them. We're going to continue this theme as we move onto the otters just down the road here. So sadly, we don't have any North American river otters, which is what I would have preferred to put here. Instead, we have the Asian small-clawed otter. This makes sense. They're very popular in zoos. They're fairly easy to keep. They're also one of the smallest otters, if not the smallest otter, I believe. The North American river otter is about double the size, if I've done my math correct. Of course, then there's the differences in where they live. They fill very similar niches in their environments because, they're otters. They're going to do what otters do. The major differences, of course, are that Asian river otters' diets include a lot of crawfish, a lot of crab. There's a lot of, river crabs from what I understand, especially in Chinese and that area of rivers. Those are not present here in North America. Instead, our otters eat an enormous amount of crayfish instead. So both of them are eating, shellfish, but they're different varieties, On top of that, where the Asian small-clawed otter is decidedly carnivorous, they're specifically piscivores, which means that they're primarily eating fish and things that live in the water. The North American river otter has, again, a much more broad diet, which is a theme that we're kind of seeing here in these differences. The North American river otters will eat, birds, mollusks, lobsters, etc. But they'll actually even eat fruit and insects, and if they can get their hands on them, they'll actually eat birds. If they can catch one that's molting and it can't fly very well, our otters will absolutely eat that. So very interesting differences in their diets. Additionally, they're dealing with very different ecological threats. The Asian small-clawed otter is currently very susceptible to pollution. They've got different regulations there, and so there's a lot more river pollution that is actively harming the natural wildlife. This has been a bit of a problem lately. It's been in the news. Hopefully they get that sorted out because they have fantastic biodiversity, and we don't want to see that lost to the economy. As for the North American side of things, the river otters, they actually have a very similar story to the bison. A lot of our animals, especially anything fluffy, for whatever reason, the colonists got here and decided that just didn't need to exist anymore. So we'll hear this story again with beavers, we heard it again with bison, but there was a massive fur trade in this case, big enough that like we're taught about it in schools to this day, and why we no longer engage with the fur trade, because they were hunting river otters to near extinction over their pelts. What they wanted was a pelt that was fairly waterproof, you know. This was a time before plastic, so anything that actually kept the water out, the rain out, or whatever, was very valuable. And then that all on top of the fact that they were seen as luxury commodities. Thankfully, as a nation, we've mostly moved past this. You know, there are a couple of places where you can still buy real furs, but these are mostly fox furs. They're mostly farmed, and these are actually being pushed out even farther as well. Hopefully that practice will end here in America as well soon. The practice of hunting otters is basically completely out. They're protected in 17 different states, which is fantastic. It means fewer needless killings. And they're actually to the point now where they've rebounded in numbers that they're actually a threat to fishing hatcheries, especially, you know, those that are sourced on the river for like river fish. So again, massive improvements in, you know, the population numbers and in conservation efforts. So hopefully we'll continue to see these kinds of things thrive in America. Alrighty, so at this point, I think that it's time to move on to my favorite enclosure, which is this deer moose exhibit. This one just worked out. It worked out fantastically. I basically didn't need to do anything except introduce the animals. We added a bit more grass, but that was really about it. Of course, this is another case where I have to analogize, but in this case, I'm using the European fallow deer. Unfortunately, we don't have any American species of deer available in the game, not without mods at least. So at the time that I was building this, we did not yet have the red deer. And later on I considered adding them back in, but it didn't make a lot of sense to me. So instead we're going with the European fallow deer, and this is sort of to be an equivalent to our native species of the white-tailed deer and the mule deer. Again, this is another case like bison and pronghorn antelope especially, where, you know, conservation efforts with deer are succeeding extremely well. However, that being said, this is another case where you know, we've run into politics, especially around hunting and eating and things like that. You know, if the fur trade is absolutely out, you know, completely out of favor, being regulated out of, you know, into oblivion, hunting sits in a very different position because a lot of the United States is still very rural, and they hold on to those sort of rural traditions, you know. So on the one hand, you have people who are absolutely about hunting and fishing and being outdoorsy, and they consider that a part of their lifestyle and a part of their culture. On the other hand, you have, you know, detractors to the practice saying that, you know, number one, the biggest point is that a lot of these deer ranches where you can go out and hunt are ranches. You know, you're not hunting a wild animal, you're basically hunting a farm animal that doesn't know it's a farm animal. Of course, the follow-up argument to this is, what's the point of killing and eating a deer when, you know, you could just go down to the grocery store and buy perfectly good cow or chicken or pig, you know. These things are available. Why do we need to go hunt the local wildlife when you can just go to Walmart? Of course, you know, the opposite argument of that has a lot to deal with, you know, poverty and economics again, where because these rural areas are often also our poorest areas, deer hunting, assuming that it's not for trophies, which again, trophy hunting is also not in political favor right now. People do not appreciate trophy hunting. At least in certain parts of the United States and other places it's more favored. I know in Texas it's relatively favored. But as far as actually hunting for meat and pelts and things like that, that's looked upon a little bit more favorably because at least you're putting your kill to good use. You know, you're eating it. Its death has a meaning. And a single deer can actually feed a family of 4 for about 8 months to a year. It's a pretty substantial amount of time. And when you contrast this with the cost of a license, it's about $100 if I understand correctly. It might be more, it might be less depending on your area. It is more economically viable for somebody to go hunt a deer, have it butchered, and then keep it in their freezer for the entire year and eat off of that than it is to go to, the superstore and go, buy cow and chicken whenever you need it, especially with all of the recent production and supply line problems that we've been having. So there's a lot of nuance to this conversation surrounding our deer, on top of, the cool facts of deer. They're really fantastic animals, Like, if you ever want to be both horrified and also impressed, look at the biology behind how deer grow those massive antlers. It's fascinating. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to get into that because the fact that, we're sort of neglecting the other half of this habitat, which is moose. I love moose, but they are an altogether different ballpark. Deer are dangerous in the sense that they like to cross roads at night and don't get out of the way quick enough. And Americans like to speed down rural roads at the speed of heat, 100, 120 miles an hour. So then they hit a deer and bad things happen. Moose are a different story. We mostly find them in Canada, Northern Europe, Alaska. I have never seen a live moose in person. My editor, who I think I've told you, is from Alaska, has apparently seen a moose. I need to emphasize something. They are agnostic, and they have informed me in no uncertain terms that they will put the fear of God in you. They're enormous. They're hard to comprehend, and they are dangerous animals. Yeah, if you see one in the wild and you're within view distance of it, that is a T-Rex, and you are the dude hiding in the bathroom. You're done for. Don't go near it. Run away. Don't be a threat. You don't want to mess with a moose. Now, of course, the other aspect of this is sort of the natural human question: can we ride them? Because if an animal exists, that seems to be our first question. It's baked in for some reason. Sadly, the answer is no. We can't ride them. And it's not because they can't carry our weight. They easily can, but they're like zebras. They will buck you off and they're gonna gore you. So we can't ride them. We can't even really farm them either. There's no good way to contain them. And on top of this, they really have very few natural predators. A calf may be taken down by a grizzly or a polar bear. That's sort of the range we're talking about here. But, once they get to adult size, the only thing that can really, take down a moose besides maybe a human is an orca. And that might sound a little bit weird, but we have to remember, moose can dive up to like 6 meters, about 20 feet underwater in order to eat the vegetation down there. And so they absolutely get bodied by orcas. It's fascinating. Of course, with this habitat, I wasn't able to do anything near like that. We're at the sort of the source of the river, so it didn't make a whole lot of sense for me to flood the area and try and make this diving space for moose, but I did try and widen it out and make it, a little bit more livable. So, as we look across, just turn our heads a little bit to the other side, we get to our beaver enclosure. This one was a ton of fun to build, which is very good because I had to do it twice. I don't have a lot of gripes with the beaver in game. I think that they're very good. I am a little bit disappointed that they don't chop down the trees in their habitats and make dams out of them. But, I understand that there's only so complicated the AI and the engine can get, So, let's talk a little bit about beavers and beaver dams, because this is fantastic, right? So, we've done a lot of research about why beavers build dams, and as far as we can tell, it's an instinctual drive. They hear water and they go ballistic. And then on top of that, they have this need for some kind of home. There's lots of trees in their natural habitat. And on top of all of this, their teeth are actually reinforced with iron. That's what gives them that red color. So they're basically perfectly built to tear down forests and build dams. Which means that aside from humans, they're one of the only animals that alters their environment on a near continental scale, which I think is amazing. But like, how does that work, right? So obviously beavers build dams, and we assume that those dams don't get very big. That's not actually true. They can block off creeks up to, thin rivers. Maybe not, the whole Mississippi, that's not going to happen. But what happens is that, as these dams get built up in these different areas, it blocks off the flow of water. That water has to go somewhere. So it either pools up into a lake, which essentially stops the source of water from migrating south, or it ends up diverting the river in a different direction, especially during rainy and flood seasons. So, the beaver dam may get washed away, and that maintains the path of the river or the creek or whatever it is. But alternatively, it can actually cause the river to sort of swing in a new direction. And if this is done enough times, what you end up with are these 100-mile or more spans where the river is just, moving around and waggling. And this is on top of the fact that that's what most rivers naturally do as well. They erode the ground, they carve new paths for the flow of the water to go down. And this has actually been, again, a bit of a contentious point here in North America because of the Mississippi River. A long story short, the Mississippi River has about 100-mile wobble range, I'll call it. And at this current point, the United States Army Corps of Engineers has basically locked down the path of the Mississippi River. It no longer has this sway or this move. Sadly, this is a bit of a detriment because it turns out that we actually needed that to happen. The ecology needed that to happen. It's also affecting, the fertility of the soil in those regions. It's causing a lot of negative economic impacts. But we're also at kind of a point in our society where we can't really just let it migrate, because that means flooding out local towns, displacing people. It also means disrupting our shipping routes. We do a lot of shipping up and down the Mississippi River. So we're sort of at this weird impasse, So it's very fascinating that, beavers and humans have this one thing in common, that, if there is a river, they're going to either move it or they're not going to move it. It's very fascinating to me. Lastly, we get on to the grizzly bear. Now, I'll be completely honest with you, we're not really going to talk about the grizzly bear today. They're very cool animals, I like them very much, and I do have a lot to say about them. But we have our next big project coming up, because remember, we've only got 4 episodes left. And I'm happy to say that we are actually going to be splitting into 2 different zoos for this one. We're no longer just going to be mainlining the one, we're going to have separate projects all going simultaneously. And one of the main ones that we're going to be doing is super focused on every bear. So that project's going to be very build heavy, it's going to be focused on one particular species, and we're really going to explore everything that we can about bears. So I hope you're looking forward to that. I'm definitely going to, talk a lot more about grizzly bears when we get there. I have the polar bear habitat done. I think you guys are going to like it. It's super cool. They've made a whole bunch of changes to polar bears that I think have gone, overlooked, that we're definitely going to talk about as well. So that's definitely something for the future. As for now, I hope that you've enjoyed this video. Thank you for joining me along on this path, and I hope to see you next time.